Okay, so we're diving into a potential migration from VMware to Nutanix.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, we're going to look at a document called Before You Migrate, Essential Considerations for Switching to Nutanix from VMware.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And, it's a pretty comprehensive document. It lays out a lot of things to think about if you're thinking about making this switch.
Right.
And I think, one of the first things that jumps out is licensing costs.
Yeah, licensing is always an adventure, right?
Yeah, with Nutanix, it can get a little bit complicated. Can
Yeah.
you maybe unpack that a little bit for folks who are coming from that VMware world where, you pretty much pay for it up front and then you have access to pretty much everything?
Yeah, VMware licensing is much more straightforward, I would say.
Yeah,
So with Nutanix, they've got this tiered licensing model,
right.
which means that you're essentially subscribing to different levels of functionality.
Yeah.
And as you scale up, or if you need more advanced features, you're going to have to move up to those higher tiers.
Okay, so it's not as simple as just comparing like the base license cost. You really need to think about
Right.
what your needs might be down the road and how those could kind of push you into those more expensive tiers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You got to be thinking long-term with Nutanix licensing.
And then there's this interesting point that the document makes about running Nutanix on VMware's ESXi hypervisor,
Yeah.
which you would think, like if you're already familiar with ESXi, that might be like the cheaper or easier route.
You would think, right.
But it turns out it could actually be more expensive.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive.
Why is that?
So essentially, you're maintaining two separate ecosystems. You've got your VMware environment, and then you've got your Nutanix environment on top of that.
Right.
So you're paying for that redundancy.
Oh, I see.
And of course, you still have to factor in the costs of your VMware licensing as well,
Right.
which hasn't gotten any cheaper.
So lesson number one, when you're looking at Nutanix, don't make assumptions about the costs.
Right.
You really need to do that thorough comparison, looking at not just the software, but the hardware and really projecting out what your needs are going to be.
Yeah, side-by-side comparison of the AHV scenario and the ESS scenario.
Right, to see where those costs might be lurking because it might not be obvious.
You got it.
Now let's talk about applications and VMs.
Okay.
Because that's the heart of any IT infrastructure, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And the document raises some red flags about compatibility. Specifically, it mentions that certain virtual appliances like firewalls sometimes only support VMware.
Yeah.
So if you switch to Nutanix's AHV hypervisor, you might be looking at rebuilding those appliances from scratch.
Right. And it's not just firewalls either.
Yeah.
Think about load balancers or WAN optimizers or any other specialized appliances that you might have in your environment.
Yeah.
You got to make sure that those have AHV versions,
Yeah.
or that you have a plan to replace those with something that will work.
Right, or find an alternative solution.
Exactly.
Now, the document also talks about OVA's open virtual appliances, and it warns that some of those might not be fully compatible with Nutanix guest tools.
Right. Those are the tools that help the VMs run smoothly on the Nutanix platform.
Right.
And, a lot of OVAs are built with VMware in mind.
Right.
So if you're trying to run one of those on Nutanix, you might run into some issues.
So even though Nutanix kind of prides itself on simplicity, you really got to make sure that your core applications and those VMs are going to be happy in that Nutanix environment.
Do your due diligence.
Yeah, or else you could be setting yourself up for a migration nightmare.
Exactly.
All right, so speaking of migration, the document dives into Nutanix Move,
Okay.
this tool that's designed to make the move from VMware to AHV smoother.
Right.
But it sounds like it's not without its quirks.
There's always a catch.
There's always a catch. So what's the good news about Nutanix Move?
Well, it definitely simplifies the process, especially if you're dealing with a large number of VMs.
Mm-hmm.
It can automate a lot of the tasks that would be really tedious to do manually.
Yeah, it takes care of a lot of the heavy lifting.
For sure.
But what about the not so good news?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that Move can have a bit of a tough time with really busy VMs.
Like VMs that are under a heavy load?
Exactly. If you've got a VM that's handling a ton of traffic or processing a lot of data, that can really slow things down.
Ah.
And in some cases, the document even suggests that you might need to power down those heavily loaded VMs during the final cutover, just to make sure that the data is transferred properly.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's not exactly a set it and forget it solution. You might need to do some extra planning and scheduling.
So like plan for some downtime potentially.
Right, especially for your critical VMs.
And the document also calls out domain controllers and SQL servers as being kind of tricky with Move.
Yeah, those are always a bit of a headache.
Why are they so challenging?
Well, domain controllers, they're the heart of your network authentication. So if anything goes wrong during the migration, it can really mess things up.
Oh, that's a big deal.
It is. And then SQL servers with their complex databases,
Yeah.
got to be really careful to make sure that the data stays consistent.
And the document actually recommends rebuilding domain controllers on Nutanix from scratch.
Yeah, sometimes it's just easier to start fresh.
So if you're dealing with those types of workloads, you got to proceed with caution.
Absolutely.
All right, so moving on from movewaring, we also need to think about our network and hardware.
The physical stuff.
Yeah, the document really stresses that your existing network and hardware, they need to play nice with Nutanix.
It's not just plug and play.
No. For example, some users have reported issues with network interface cards, or NICs, when they're using certain types of switches.
Yeah, there can be some compatibility issues that you wouldn't expect.
Like what?
Well, the document specifically mentions Meraki switches.
Okay.
Some people have seen frame errors between their Nutanix hosts and those Meraki switches.
It's like they're not speaking the same language.
Right.
So what's the fix for that?
Well, in some cases, installing expansion NIC cards has solved the problem.
Like giving them a translator so they can understand each other.
Exactly.
And then on the topic of performance, the document recommends using RDMA and NVMe storage to get the most out of Nutanix.
Right, especially if you're in a demanding environment.
So what exactly is RDMA?
It stands for Remote Direct Memory Access,
Okay.
and it's a way to bypass a lot of the usual steps involved in transferring data between servers.
Like cutting out the middleman.
Yeah, it lets the data hop directly between the memory of the sending server and the receiving server.
So it's all about speed.
Right,
And-
especially for applications that are really data intensive.
And NVMe storage, what's that all about?
NVMe drives are a lot faster than traditional hard drives or even SSDs,
Oh, wow.
so they can really boost performance.
So it sounds like RDMA and NVMe are like the dynamic duo of performance enhancement?
Yeah, you could say that.
But if you're using hybrid nodes with
Yeah.
those spinning disks, you might not see the same kind of performance gains.
Right.
Okay, so RDMA and NVMe if you need that top-notch performance.
Yep.
But if you're on a tighter budget and your workloads aren't as demanding, then those hybrid nodes might be a more practical choice.
Makes sense.
Now let's talk about role-based access control, or RBAC.
Okay.
What does the document say about Nutanix's RBAC capabilities?
Well, it acknowledges that especially in earlier versions, Nutanix's RBAC wasn't quite as granular as VMware's.
So it's harder to set up those very specific roles and permissions.
Right. You might find yourself having to use the command line interface, or CLI, for tasks that you could easily do through a graphical user interface, or GUI, in VMware.
So that adds a layer of complexity for the administrators?
Yeah.
But there is some good news, right?
Yes. Newer versions of Nutanix have improved their RBAC features,
Okay.
so they are more flexible and granular now.
So it's getting better.
It is.
Huh.
But it's still something to keep in mind if you rely heavily on very specific roles and permissions.
All right, now let's talk about the overall management experience.
Okay.
Going from those familiar VMware tools to Nutanix's Prism interface, there's going to be a learning curve there.
For sure.
So what are some of the key differences that someone coming from VMware should be aware of?
Well, one thing that stands out is the ecosystem of third-party tools and plugins.
Right.
VMware has a huge network of third-party integrations. Nutanix is still catching up.
Oh, I see.
So you might find that certain OVAs or tools that you're used to using with VMware aren't available for Nutanix.
And that could be a deal breaker for some organizations.
Right.
But Nutanix Prism does offer a more unified management experience.
Yeah, it can be simpler in some ways.
So it's a trade-off.
It is.
You might lose some flexibility, but you gain a more streamlined environment.
Potentially.
Now, what about support and community resources? The document highlights how important those are during and after the migration.
Absolutely.
So how does Nutanix stack up against VMware in terms of support?
Well, Nutanix does provide dedicated support for migration projects.
Okay, that's good.
They'll have engineers working with you to make sure things go smoothly.
But the document does point out that finding experienced Nutanix professionals can be a bit more challenging than finding VMware experts.
Yeah, it's true. The pool of Nutanix expertise is still smaller.
So what does that mean for organizations that are making this switch?
Well, you might have to invest more in training your existing team
Right.
or be prepared to pay a premium for consultants.
So building up that internal Nutanix expertise is key.
Absolutely.
And speaking of learning curves, let's be realistic. Moving from VMware to Nutanix, it's not going to be a walk in the park.
No, it's a journey.
It's a journey, and the document emphasizes that there are differences in the management, the architecture, the operational procedures,
It's a different way of thinking.
and you'll likely need to use the command line interface, or CLI, for some tasks.
Especially for those more advanced configurations.
So even if your team is comfortable with the VMware CLI, they're still going to have to learn the Nutanix CLI.
Yep, it's a different animal.
So it's not just about learning new commands, it's about adapting to a new way of managing your infrastructure. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've discussed, and then we'll come back to wrap things up and explore some final thoughts.
Sounds good.
All right, so we really dug into all the details of migrating from VMware to Nutanix, and it's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple flip of a switch.
No, it's a process. It's a journey. And, like any big journey, it's important to be prepared, right? Like,
Yeah.
have the right tools, have the right mindset.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And be prepared for some detours along the way.
Exactly.
And-
Because we've uncovered a few, haven't we?
We have.
Uh,
But, every detour is a chance to learn and adapt.
that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
So speaking of the journey, the document we're looking at, it actually ends on a pretty positive note.
Yeah, it does.
It acknowledges all the challenges, but it ultimately suggests that making this move to Nutanix, especially with their AHV hypervisor, it can be a real win.
Yeah, I mean, it's not all doom and gloom.
No, it's not. What are some of the key takeaways that the document highlights in terms of those benefits?
Well, it emphasizes that moving from VMware to Nutanix can unlock significant benefits in terms of scalability, simplified management, and even cost-effectiveness.
As long as you do your homework on that licensing.
Right, exactly. You got to be smart about the licensing.
Yeah.
But it also highlights that Nutanix really shines when you fully embrace their ecosystem.
So it's not just about swapping out the hardware and software, it's about adopting a new way of thinking about your infrastructure.
Right, it's about embracing the Nutanix way of doing things.
And the document stresses that the migration process itself, it requires careful planning preparation and a deep understanding of both platforms.
Yeah, you can't just wing it.
No,
Right.
you got to have a plan. You got to do your research. So it sounds like due diligence is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely.
Don't rush into this decision. Really take the time to assess where you're at, what your team's skills are, what your needs are, before you commit to making that switch.
Right.
We've been talking a lot about the technical aspects of this migration, but I'm wondering about the human element.
Yeah.
Because any big IT change, it impacts the people who are using and managing those systems.
Absolutely. People are a critical part of this equation.
So what are some things that organizations should keep in mind when it comes to managing that human side of the migration?
Well, I think communication is key. You got to keep your team informed through the entire process.
Right. No one likes surprises.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let them know why you're making the switch, what the timeline is, what the potential impact is going to be on their roles and responsibilities.
Transparency is really important.
It is. And don't forget about training and support. Give your team the resources they need to succeed.
So it's not just about announcing a new technology. It's about empowering your team to embrace it.
Right. Make them feel like they're part of the journey.
I love that. So we've talked about cost compatibility, migration support. We've even touched on the human side of IT transformations. Is there anything else we should hit on before we move to our final thoughts?
There's one thing that the document mentions that I think deserves a little more exploration.
Okay, what's that?
It talks about how well Nutanix performs in high-performance environments.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting, especially considering how demanding IT infrastructure is becoming these days.
So we know that Nutanix is often praised for its scalability and efficiency, but are there any specific use cases where it really shines, like where it really outperforms the competition?
Well, one area where Nutanix is gaining a lot of traction is supporting big data and analytics workloads.
Okay.
Those workloads, they require a ton of storage and processing power.
Right, massive amounts of data.
And Nutanix's hyper-converged infrastructure is really well suited to handle that.
So the scalability and simplified management that we talked about earlier, those are huge advantages when you're dealing with big data.
Absolutely. And Nutanix also offers features like data tiering and deduplication, which can help optimize storage utilization and reduce costs.
So if our listener is working with large data sets or running analytics applications, Nutanix could be a really good fit for their needs.
Definitely something to consider.
What about other emerging use cases? Is Nutanix making a mark anywhere else?
Yeah, they're also making waves in virtual desktop infrastructure, or VDI.
Okay.
With more people working remotely Organizations need VDI solutions that are robust and scalable,
Makes sense.
and Nutanix can simplify the deployment and management of those environments.
So if our listeners thinking about implementing or expanding their VDI capabilities, Nutanix is worth a closer look.
For sure.
What about edge computing? Everything seems to be moving to the edge these days.
Yeah, edge computing is definitely becoming more and more important.
So how does Nutanix fit into that picture?
Well, as more devices and applications move to the edge of the network, the demand for reliable, scalable, and easily manageable infrastructure at the edge is growing rapidly.
Right.
And Nutanix is offering solutions specifically designed for edge deployments,
Oh, wow.
providing the same benefits of simplicity, scalability, and performance that they're known for in the data center.
So it sounds like Nutanix is aiming to be that one-stop shop for modern IT infrastructure, covering everything from the core data center to the edge.
They want to be the platform that can handle it all.
And that's a pretty compelling proposition.
It is. It's not just about what Nutanix can do today. It's about where they're headed in the future.
So it's not just a replacement for VMware, it's a platform that can enable organizations to embrace new technologies and adapt to the evolving IT landscape.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important for our listener to remember that technology never stands still. What's cutting edge today might be old news tomorrow.
Right.
So how can our listeners stay ahead of the curve and make informed decisions about their IT infrastructure as things continue to change?
I think it all starts with curiosity.
Wow.
Don't be afraid to explore new technologies, attend industry events, read articles and white papers, talk to other IT professionals.
So it's about being a lifelong learner in the IT world?
Absolutely. Never stop exploring. Never stop questioning. Never stop seeking out new
Hey,
knowledge.
don't be afraid to experiment.
Yeah. Set up a lab environment, try out different technologies, see how they perform in real-world scenarios.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of VMware and Nutanix, our message to our listener is this. The decision to migrate is complex. Do your research, weigh the pros and cons, and most importantly, be prepared for the journey ahead.
And remember, the IT landscape is constantly evolving. Stay curious, stay informed, and never stop exploring new possibilities.
Wow. It feels like we've really covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into this whole VMware to Nutanix migration thing.
Yeah, we really went deep, didn't we?
We did. We explored, the good, the bad, the everything in between.
The whole enchilada.
The whole enchilada, exactly. So as we wrap things up, what are your kind of final thoughts on all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that this migration, just like any other big IT decision, it takes a lot of thought and planning.
Yeah.
It's not just about swapping out one technology for another.
Right.
It's about really understanding what your needs are and how this change is going to affect your organization.
And being prepared for those bumps in the road.
Exactly. Those bumps are going to come no matter what.
Yeah, so it's not if, it's when.
It's when.
So it's like we've given our listener this toolkit, right?
Yeah.
All these insights and things to think about to help them navigate this whole process.
Yeah, a roadmap of sorts.
A roadmap, exactly. We
Yeah.
talked about, comparing costs, making sure your applications are going to work, understanding Nutanix move, and really being ready for that learning curve.
Yeah, and I think we did a good job of highlighting how important the people side of this is, too.
Right.
You got to communicate with your team. You got to give them the training and support they need. You got to make them feel like they're part of this whole thing.
It's not just about the technology, it's about the people.
Exactly.
And, we also talked about all those exciting possibilities for the future.
Yeah.
Nutanix isn't just about replacing VMware. It's about being ready for those new technologies like big data and VDI and edge computing.
It's about staying ahead of the game.
Staying ahead of the game, exactly. So it's not just about what Nutanix can do today. It's about what it can help you do tomorrow.
Right.
And as we close out this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that technology, it never stands still.
That always changing.
Always changing. And what's brand new today might be old news tomorrow.
Yeah, the pace of innovation is incredible.
So I guess the question is, how do you keep up with all of that? How do you make sure you're making smart decisions as the IT landscape keeps shifting?
I think the key is to stay curious.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to check out new technologies,
Mm-hmm.
go to conferences, read articles, talk to other IT folks.
Be a lifelong learner.
Exactly.
That's help learning.
And don't be afraid to get your hands dirty.
Yeah.
Try things out. Set up a lab environment experiment.
That's how you really learn.
It is.
So to our listener, as we wrap up this deep dive into VMware and Nutanix, we say this decision is a big one. Do your research, weigh the pros and cons, and be ready for the journey.
Yeah, and enjoy the ride.
Enjoy the ride because the IT world, it's an exciting place to be.
It is. And who knows what the future holds.
That's the best part.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, happy exploring.